We've been working a lot with the Hardy-Weinberg equations in order to help us measure evolutionary change. And so at this point, we want to feel really comfortable just with the equations. What do these variables represent? And what sort of information can we get by looking at allele frequencies and genotype frequencies? And so all of this information has been helping us quantify or measure evolutionary change by taking data and examining that data to see if we're actually seeing a change in the allele frequency for the whole population. And so as we start to move on and we talk about, well, what if I am looking at a population? So what if I am looking at a group of organisms and I notice that the allele frequency is changing? Because under normal circumstances, we would expect the allele frequencies to stay the same. So if we can imagine this population and generation and generation and generation always looks about the same. Well, it turns out that if the allele frequency is staying the same, then we're going to expect to find these conditions: large population size, random mating, no mutations, no immigration, no selection. A lot of populations are not changing, and it's usually because of these 5 characteristics that we call the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So we're working on understanding what these 5 characteristics are. We're also looking at understanding what if one of those characteristics changes. So what if there is a small population, like with genetic drift and bottleneck effect or founder effect? What if there's a really small population? Or what if there are mutations? What if there's non-random mating? What if there's natural selection? What if there's gene flow? And that is when we'll start to see evolutionary change in a population. So we might have had diversity and all of a sudden we have no diversity. Or we might have the opposite. We might have had no diversity and all of a sudden there is diversity. The key is looking at how does a population evolutionary change, keeping in mind that a single individual does not change. And so at this point we want to be able to A, calculate if change is occurring, B, predict what is actually causing that change, and C, anticipate what it would look like in the future. If we have certain conditions, will it keep changing? Or if we have other conditions, will the change stop or slow? If we keep changing, eventually we're going to be so different that sometimes we can't interbreed. The organisms can't interbreed. And so we keep in mind, and here's this question: how does variation lead to new species? When we look at evolution, sometimes the hallmark of evolution is when we actually have organisms that can no longer mate. They have so many differences that they are no longer able to produce offspring. And so how does this actually happen? And so we want to keep in mind variation, that this is usually going to have to be genetic differences that lead to phenotype differences. And under normal circumstances, this variation stays in the gene pool. So we're talking about in one gene pool. And really a gene pool has to do with who is mating. So normally when we look at variation, we're talking about within a species, within a group of organisms that interbreed. So if you've got a snake and a frog, well, they're not mating. So their variations are kind of ambiguous, because it doesn't really matter that the snake and the frog are that different. When we start to look at within a gene pool, within a species, sometimes we will actually see so much change that they no longer mate. So we want to make sure we know what a species is. A species is a group of organisms that interbreed, meaning mate, and produce viable, fertile offspring. So, for example, if you take a horse and you take a donkey, they are able to mate and they produce a mule. But the mule is sterile. The mule can't reproduce. And so even if you mate a mule with a mule, even if you mate a mule with a donkey, even if you mate a mule with a horse, the offspring are sterile. They can't reproduce. And so a species is really considered organisms that interbreed and reproduce. And we start to see this idea of a species when we write the scientific name. That's actually a really important place for the species. If you remember from Bio 1, a scientific name has two parts, the genus and the species, genus being capitalized, species being lowercase, and either in italics or underline. And of course, this is part of the larger taxonomy. We'll learn how to give a full scientific name a little bit later. But the key idea here is that as organisms change over time, so we start to see, we can take this example where we've got 4 different subspecies of organisms. So because the name of a species means they can interbreed and make fertile offspring, these 4 are actually all the same species. But they're considered subspecies because they never really interact. They're not in the same general area. And so geographic isolation is one of those examples that sometimes leads to new species. And that's one of those agents of change that we've talked about. So a new species will arise when we no longer interbreed. And that's at what point we become different species. Again, keeping in mind that there are a lot of factors that play into it. And scientific naming, as boring as it seems to come up with names, is actually really sophisticated because we have to take into account, well, if I bring these 2 together, they can breed. But because they're so far apart, they're not often likely to breed. What we start to notice is this idea of variation, but also of separation. As we start to combine the ideas of all of this variation changing and leading to new species, we begin to look at the idea that a single common ancestor can give rise to a variety of species. And this is called adaptive radiation. Now we do want to take a second and just talk about what adaptive or adaptation means. So an adaptation, and this is a really important vocabulary word, is actually an inherited trait that increases survival. But keep in mind, it's not just survival, and reproduction. So when we use this term adaptive radiation, we're looking at the accumulation of adaptations, which are inherited traits, which are really just mutations. We want to keep in mind that the key point to natural selection and evolution is really the idea of a mutation. So we start to see that we can have a common ancestor, and that common ancestor could have a lot of different variation. So one way that we represent this is here's a common ancestor, and we've got all of this different variation. So we might have variation in feather color, and they might still be the same species. But then we might also have some of these vary in beak size. And some of this variety might vary in eye shape and might vary in beak sharpness. And then we start to see this idea that as we start to get more and more different and accumulate more and more variation, sometimes we reach the point, we radiate to the point, very much like a bicycle wheel. This radiation can lead to many new species. So we start with one common ancestor, and the variety that exists is actually going to lead to a really large variety. So a lot of people think that natural selection means getting rid of variety, but sometimes it also leads to increased variety. There are a few really important examples that we need to understand that relate to this. The first is something called an allopatric population. The second is called a sympatric population. So these patterns are going to lead to speciation. So an allopatric population is a population that is going to be separated geographically. And sometimes we call that geographical isolation. Meaning we're separated by space. So an example might be that all of a sudden a river floods and the river changes the path, and now two populations are separate. Once we're separated by space, we no longer interbreed. Now if I brought them together, they might be able to. But as this goes on over generations, we have so much variety that we are now a new species. This is actually a great example when we look at the Grand Canyon. So there's a really interesting example of some squirrels that used to be the same species, and they were separated when the Grand Canyon formed with the river flowing through that land, and now they can no longer interbreed. The other type are called sympatric, and sym really kind of means together or similar. So these are populations that live together, but for some reason don't mate. And so what we want to look at real quickly are a few mechanisms or reasons why we might live together but we might not mate. So you do need to know these words, allopatric and sympatric. So here are some reasons why we might no longer mate. They're divided into two categories, pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. Post-zygotic meaning after fertilization. Pre-zygotic meaning before. So it might be ecological, and really this means like your habitat. So you might live in different parts of a tree. So maybe you live in the branches, maybe you're a beetle in the branches, maybe you're a beetle in the roots. And so it's not true geographical isolation, it's just that you never run into each other. It might be behavioral. So an example with this is mating songs. Maybe you don't sing the right song. Maybe there's variation in the song. Temporal means time. So what time do you mate? Keep in mind, this really all has to do with mating. It might be mechanical. So maybe your parts don't fit. It might be that you run into each other, you have the right mating dance, it's the right time of year, your parts might fit, but your gametes just don't fuse. The last part are post-zygotic, and this is going to mean that the zygote dies, the zygote is sterile, or it might mean that you have a huge new number of chromosomes. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in